Hi everyone, and welcome. My name is Ina. I am the Executive Director at Boundless Theatre, and I am so excited to welcome you all to this Boundless Ideas Space, and this talk, which is Growing Up Under the Male Gaze. I am joined here today by Charlie and Zing, and yeah, we are going to talk about basically quite a relevant, hot issue that feels like it gains more and more momentum as we go through the ages, but especially now. Introduce you both. So Charlie, Josephine, she is actually, is a writer that we are currently working with for a show called Flies that we are co-producing with Shoreditch Town Hall in 2022. They are an actor and writer and has recently played Mercutio at the RSC, and your work includes Bitch Boxer and Blush and Pops. And then we have Zing Tsjeng. Zing is the author and journalist who has written a wonderful series of books called Forgotten Women, and she's currently the executive editor of Vice UK. And so I thought it would be great to just talk a little bit about your own experience growing up and how the male gaze affected you in your childhood. Big question. Straight into it.
Do you want to start? Yeah, I'm happy to start. God, that's a big question. I guess it's affected me in different ways. So when I was growing up, like as a teenager, I was quite a tomboy. I presented as quite butch. And I was frequently like misgendered. I got kicked out of the toilet once. That was fun. So I kind of feel like growing up I had quite a complicated relationship with the male gaze in that sometimes it was females perceiving me to be a gender that I wasn't. And that was also in a way not comfortable for me. And I think that one of the things that I found really interesting about growing up, so I grew up in Singapore, and I went to kind of all girls schools, was that the way that my gender was perceived by other girls in school when I kind of dressed in a more masculine way was that they kind of treated me like I was a little bit of a boy myself, which I found really interesting. And then it was only when I started kind of dressing in a more feminine way in high school and sixth form that I kind of felt like sexualized more by straight guys, by like straight boys that I encountered, whether that was at school or like in, like everyday life. And to be honest, I found it kind of confusing. I was kind of like, what is happening? And when I went to the UK to study for my A-levels, I think that's when I suddenly realized that, oh, this is a real thing. And it then took on a really like racialized aspect as well, because I was for the first time in an ethnic minority. So then it became kind of stuff like being catcalled in like a really like racist way, for instance. And so that was also a new experience for me. So I feel like my entire life I've been on the back foot when it comes to like the male gaze. I've always been trying to be like, why is this happening to me? Like, what is it about like me that kind of like incites these kind of reactions? And obviously, it's all down to kind of patriarchy and why, people make judgments and assumptions based on how you dress and how you present. So I've had a kind of changing relationship with that over time.
Yeah. Does that echo with you, Charlie?
Yeah, really similar. It's definitely like gender non-conforming from a young age. Because I'm white and working class, that's like quite a specific, you're given quite a lot of room to be a tomboy. So yeah, running around in shorts and t-shirt basically quite a lot, and like feeling very free in my body and like, oh, I'm really fast, and oh, I can climb trees, and like, oh, I can play football better than the boys, and like, and then hitting puberty and was like, oh, something's definitely changed now, like, and then it felt like a lot of pressure to like grow out of it and like suddenly present not only feminine but like sexualized feminine. So it was like going from being a lad to like a sexy woman like that. It was quite a lot of pressure as a teenager. It was very confusing for me. and yeah, catcalling and that street harassment, and just very aware of like being looked at and how that made me then perform like I think I was just playing with it. I think there's something joyful about being a teenager and experiencing the male gaze and then playing, but there's also a lot of danger and threat and like stress and violence in it. But there is like 2% in my experience, maybe it's more for other people, but there was 2% of like, oh, like I'm suddenly a little bit powerful because I'm getting looked at, and it was fun for a little bit at times, but that was shaming to talk about, so you didn't talk about that bit, and it very quickly turned not fun. So it was very complicated, basically.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of like having to think about my external, my aesthetic, my style, what I was wearing, how I was walking, how I was sitting, what my hair was doing. Quite a lot of like outside stuff that didn't really match how I was feeling on the inside.
Did that feel like a sudden moment for you? Because I certainly remember it being a very sudden kind of, oh, I'm now very aware of myself, my body, and the presence that I have in front of other people. Was it a sudden moment for you, or do you think it was gradual?
For me, it was sudden because I got my hair cut when I was like 16 in like a really trendy, I used to work in a barber's. So, and all of a sudden I got my hair cut and I looked older than I was. And suddenly all the men whose hair I'd been cutting and washing and like all these builders that I'd known for years were suddenly looking at me like I was a woman for the first time. Whereas before I was like one of the lads. And it had just happened very quickly in a haircut. So yeah, there was that experience where I was like, definitely looked at differently, like overnight.
Yeah.
Hair's mad. People are a bit obsessed with hair, aren't they?
It's very true.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much we read. Like mine's the shortest it's ever been at the moment, and like I definitely get looked at differently the shorter my hair is.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I'm also very curious about how this has sort of changed over the years. So I'm 32 years old, and my experience is probably quite connected to that period of time. But thinking about young people who are perhaps teenagers now going through this experience now, what do you think might be different about their experience that we perhaps did not experience?
I feel like maybe like the celebrity culture has really shifted. So I'm 32 as well, and growing up, you know, in the early 2000s, late 90s, you had these kind of like Paris Hilton, Misha Barton, the OC, you know, all these kind of Hollywood celebrities who were really, really thin. And I think one of the most shocking things for me was going back and watching my old Destiny's Child videos and just seeing like all three of them are so much thinner than they are now. Like Beyonce is like half her size. And that was just kind of considered the natural, normal kind of body type for everyone, and how alienating that was to grow up in that kind of body culture where you had to be literally stick thin with your like rib cage, with your like, you know, hip bones and rib cage showing, so you could wear like, you know, like Miss 60 low slung jeans and stuff like that. And I think now, I think that's kind of changed slightly, so there's more kind of diversity of body types, but it's still, you know, there's still like a kind of predominant beauty ideal. It's just kind of shifted slightly. And what I worry about is, you know, I'm worried that it could just easily slide back, because then people get used to it and then they're like, oh, what's a new thing? And then it becomes like extreme thinness becomes a new exciting thing again. So yeah, I feel like that's one thing I'm worried about, but I do think it has shifted quite a lot for young people growing up.
Yeah, I'm going to be 32 next week, so I'm just behind you both. But like, yeah, I didn't have the internet in my pocket until I was 18 or 19, I think I got my first iPhone. And that like, definitely, it's a huge culture shift, like it's the understatement of the century, but like, because I remember my sister, who's a bit older than me, would like buy like magazines. Can't remember the name. Maybe it was Glamour magazine, something like that. She would buy one. Not even maybe once a month. Did you buy magazines? That's so weird, isn't it? So like she would have this like influx of like media maybe once a month that was like in this little book with glossy pages, and it was like, oh, I might cut out that page and that would be like your style icon. But now it's just all the time, like in your pocket, and that must be a lot of pressure, I think. And also the fact that you've got a camera on your phone means that you're more likely to take photos of yourself. I mean, yeah, I'm really glad I didn't get a camera on my phone until I was like 18 or 19, because I think any younger I might have just gone mad. But then whenever I speak to young people, they seem much more chill about it than I am. So they seem to be okay, I think. I don't know, but I think there's more like, there's just more.
Yeah, there's like so much more content and so much more images and so much kind of more visual culture than there used to be, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just chatting to someone earlier, like I'm going to experiment in July for a month. We're having a brick phone. I'm really interested in what that's going to do to my experience of being in the world. It's not going to have a camera on it. So when I walk somewhere, I'm not going to take a photo and be like, oh, well, send that to a friend or whatever. It's going to be interesting. And like this last year, I've lived on my own for the first time in a long time. And obviously we've been in pandemic, so like I've been on Zoom, so you can see like that top part of me. And like I'm single at the moment, so it's like there's no male gaze in my house, in my flat. There's no gaze. It's just me. There's no one there. Do you know what I mean? So like, what's it like when there's no gaze? Like, are you still like when I'm choosing what to wear, even if I'm not going to be seen that day? It's just been an interesting like little mental exercise in my head of going like, oh, do I wear certain clothes for other people, even when no one's going to see me?
Yeah.
Like, what am I dressing for my insides? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So having those spaces where there's no gaze is really useful,
Yeah.
I think. And like
Definitely.
queer spaces where it just feels a bit more fluid is really useful.
Yeah.
I don't know, sorry, that was off topic.
No, it was great. I was actually just going to come to Flies, which is the play you've written for us. And that play is really about young women and the male gaze at a time when their body is changing. Do you think we, by we I mean society, does enough to prepare young people for that experience?
No,
I agree.
there's no preparation.
There's no preparation.
At all. Unless you've got really cool parents, like, or like an amazing community leader, or like one really good teacher. Like my friend's a secondary school teacher and he's sick. Like, he's a beautiful feminist gay man that is like sneaking in, like he's going under the radar in his school, and he's like teaching them at boys' school at the moment. And I'm really excited for those young men, because honestly, like, to have one kind of person that you look up to that is honest about what's going on is life-changing. But yeah, I'm very angry at the government. I'm angry at the hangover from Section 28. I'm angry about the shit sex education system in this country that just is like woefully outdated. I'm frustrated. But again, whenever I've met young people, they're doing much better than I feel like they might be doing. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, I don't want to patronise them or do them a disservice. Young people's mental health is in crisis, apparently, like, if you look at the statistics, but also they're really smart and really positive and like doing all right. So I don't know, it's nuanced. But in answer to your question, nah,
No.
not at all.
Would you agree with that, Zing?
Yeah, I mean, I remember kind of doing work around and covering, you know, the Everyone's Invited Instagram page, which is kind of like all these testimonies from girls at school right now talking about rape culture and sexual harassment in schools. And I think there was like a recent Ofsted report that said something like 90% of girls said they've been sexually harassed at school. And I thought that was really shocking, but then I also kind of think part of it is people finally have the language to describe what it is. So, you know, when, you know, I was getting, you know, sexually harassed at school or whatever, you know, we didn't know it was sexual harassment. We didn't know it was technically, you know, it was illegal and it was unacceptable. We kind of had to kind of brush it off and assume it was fine, you know. But I think now what's happening is that the younger generation are really clued up and educated, and they're ready to like call it out for what it is. And the issue is like, this thing is happening. Will the government, will schools, will like heads of schools be willing to do anything about it? Or are they just going to try and, you know, save their own skin and, you know, go in it for a PR exercise and not actually try and make really difficult, lasting change? Because it's like people are telling us this is the problem, but it's up to us whether or not we want to do anything about it.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And where does social media fit in all of this, do we think?
I mean, I feel like, you know, stuff like Everyone's Invited is a really good example of how social media can help raise the conversation. But I also think in some ways social media has allowed people and given them a forum to kind of also bully and harass people. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, really. Like, the kind of anonymity of social media kind of lends itself to both holding people to account and also just, you know, bullying them and making their lives really difficult. So it's kind of difficult, I think, to kind of come down on it one way or another for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel the same. I think it's nuanced. It's like, there's something really empowering about being in control of the gaze. Like, you take your own selfie, you decide how you want to pose or what you want to wear. And I see a lot of young people like in command of that, but also it's like influenced by, and you're still growing and learning, and like, it's a really complicated thing, and it's public and it's on the internet forever. So I don't know how I feel about it, to be honest. And obviously, like, it can be amazing for queer communities where perhaps in your actual local, like, geography, you don't have people that you can connect to, and so you can online. That's an amazing resource. But then you're also open to, like, more harassment, more transphobia, like, more homophobia, because the awareness has raised in, like, the kind of collective consciousness, so has the harassment. It's really interesting. Like, I can't believe that there's still examples in the newspaper of, like, young women being killed. I'm like, what? Like, after the last year we've had, like, I don't know why I expect the world to change, but I just sort of do sometimes. And then you read it in the newspaper and you're like, oh my God, we're still here. Like, still.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Why are we not teaching boys? Why are we not more in command of what we're teaching boys and that they need to be in order to be men? And, like, why are we still focusing on teaching girls how to be safe? Like, it's just very outdated still. It's frustrating.
Yeah. And how would you recommend that conversation is had if there are people watching who are perhaps educators or have influence over young minds? How would you portray this issue to them?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there was that company, I think they were called Sexplain, and now they're called something else, like Teaching the Talk or something. There's some really cool companies that are doing sex education work. So the school, like, hire them to come in, which I think is much better than, like, your maths teacher, like, blushing their way through. Like, it's awkward because that maths teacher is a human being who's got their own history with sex and sexuality and identity and power and masculinity, and, you know, like, that's a nuanced human who's fragile that's been asked to do this one-off sex education class. It's like, it's not fair on the teachers either, do you know what I mean? So to hire a company that come in and it's a group of, like, cool young people with nice trainers and tattoos, and they're going to talk about consent and conversations and how to be safe on the internet and like queer relationships and masturbation and pleasure and all the stuff that we just were not taught. I think that's probably the way forward, really, so that they can come in and do that. And I think it has to start younger in an age-appropriate way. I think kids are much smarter than we think they are, and we're a bit embarrassed to think about children as being sexualised for obvious reasons, but, like, it all starts much younger than we want to accept it does, and it's actually dangerous to ignore it, I think.
Yeah.
So finding a way of talking about it that's, like, safe and just, like, normalising it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember my teacher in biology taught us sex ed, and turned out that nobody actually checked her credentials because she was just, like, a raging fundamentalist Christian. And showed us this terrible, like, anti-abortion film.
Oh no!
Where, I kid you not, it was all told from the perspective of the unborn fetus, like, doing a little baby voice. And when she goes in to have the abortion, the baby's she's like, why, honey? And it's literally like, and we were all just, like, laughing. and she got so mad at us that she left the classroom.
Wow.
I was like, this is a classic example of why you should never get the regular teachers in to teach, because you don't know what kind of agendas they're bringing in either.
No, we just need a kind of like, here's all of the information and here's how you make an educated adult choice for yourself. And here's how to admit it when you've made a mistake. And here's how to clean up your mess. And like accepting that it's a lifelong process and you can change as you grow, and like not like a politicized like that's mad.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Mad.
that experience. Mental.
That is mad.
I mean, it's lucky everyone hated her because she was a terrible biology teacher, so nobody took it seriously.
Thank goodness. I want to move us into the direction of representation in the mainstream media. And Charlie, your play, Flies, is about kind of reclaiming a story about boys. Talk to me a little bit about that process, why you've chosen to sort of reclaim quite a male-focused story.
Yeah. So the play started as an adaptation of Lord of the Flies. And then we quite quickly got bored of that, didn't we? And like, just actually, then I just got overwhelmed at the realisation that like, all the stories are written by men about men for men. And I just kind of stared at the walls for a couple of days at like the weight of that, like of just patriarchy. Like I really felt it in my body for a while and was like, yeah. And then how do you find yourself, the kind of mental gymnastics that women and queer people do in order to like fit themselves into stories where the protagonist is like a white cis heterosexual male, like it's exhausting. So yeah, then it became about like the male canon of work and about the male gaze in storytelling, and then I met a load of young women that were amazing and heard some of their stories and was reminded viscerally of what it's like to hit puberty and then suddenly, without your consent, be the like object of attention, and given no tools to manage that, and also no conversation. And then if you do talk to your mum or your auntie or like older women about it, they kind of are like, oh well, at least you're still getting some attention or something. There's like a weird hierarchy that happens about age, and like as soon as you hit like, I don't know, 30, mid-30s or whatever, then you're like not of interest anymore anyway. So like, it's just, there's so much shame that gets inherited and is a bit mad. So yeah, it suddenly became about that basically, and like, what do we do? And like, are we all alright about this? Like, did we all decide this on a day when I was off, like, and I've come back and it's just happening? 'Cause, like, I don't remember agreeing to any of this. And do we want to continue like this, or actually? And then more recently, I've been thinking about, like, especially as I'm presenting more masculine, and if I'm out with my male friends and they treat me like one of the lads now, if like some young women walk past and I catch them looking, and then they catch me catching them looking, there's a whole complex thing that's happening where they're like, oh, I'm not really sure if I'm allowed to do the bro thing with you or not. And it's like, that's interesting as well, like the pressure that I'm getting a flavour of what it's like to be on the other side of the gaze, and it's not as comfortable as I thought it was.
And what about for you, Zing, thinking about the male gaze and how it affects you now as a woman in her 30s?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, because I think until I came to the UK, I didn't realise how racialised male gaze could be. And I recently did a story talking to other Asian women in the UK about what it was like, you know, being objectified and looked at by, like, in a predominantly white country. And the thing that really struck me was that it all started for them really, really young. So there was this one woman I spoke to who said she was like 13 in school uniform walking around like West London somewhere with her dad, and a guy rode up in a car and stuck his head out and to her dad, not even speaking to her, said, "How much did you pay for her?" And it was just like so horrendous that like it was just like a toxic combination of like the male gaze, but then also just like systematic racism that makes people think Asian women are just like all sex workers. And I think like that's been my experience, and like even as I like get older, is that you know, like in the last year, I've had like instances of COVID-related harassment and racism, and like a lot of them have kind of taken the flavor of like sexual harassment. So it'll be like, oh, haha, like kind of, I think the one that stuck out for me was this guy was like sexually harassing me in a park, and then another guy came up and I was like, oh my God, he's gonna, you know, tell him off, you know, finally there's like a good guy in the world or whatever. And then he just like pointed straight at me and was like, oh, you shouldn't because, you know, COVID. And it was like, geez, thanks. So now I've been like I've been like hate crime in 2 different ways. So I think that's been like my experience. It's just like inextricable from like my ethnicity. And I think that if I'd grown up in the country, like from a young age, maybe I wouldn't have like noticed it because it would have just been like this to me all the time. But it was definitely like really noticeable for me, like moving here when I was like 16. Like it took on a completely different kind of flavor.
Yeah. So your book, Zing, really celebrate sort of untold stories of really inspirational women. Is there a story that you can think of a woman, a young woman perhaps, who has really reclaimed the male gaze in a really powerful way?
So I mean, my favorite one from the books, although I really shouldn't play favorites, is this Chinese pirate called Tsjeng, who really early on like inherited this kind of like battalion of pirate ships, and she came from Canton, so there were loads of like kind of what they called floating brothels along the sea. So she came from a brothel, and she married into this dynasty, and then very quickly on she just kind of like took over completely, and she married her way upwards. So she was like really reclaiming that kind of like status, until she really hit like the top of the hierarchy, and she was just like a great pirate. She makes a cameo in Pirates of the Caribbean, but it's a terrible shit like cameo. And she had this whole system of laws and rules. So like if you were caught stealing from like, you know, stealing from like her loot, you were like tossed overboard. If you committed an act of sexual violence, you had your like hands chopped off and tossed into the sea. And eventually she just was so good at just kind of like looting and pillaging and all the things that pirates do, that the Chinese government paid her to retire. They were kind of like, you're just too good, so we're just gonna have to give you a load of money to just like leave us alone. And then she kind of like disappears in the historic record, but then people think she went and set up a gambling den somewhere and like retired on all her riches. And yeah, I think that's just such an amazing story of someone who like, you know, grew up in like challenging circumstances and then kind of like used whatever like limited power she could to really like claw her way up and out.
I love that. That's amazing. Why do we not see that on Netflix?
Michelle Yeoh's meant to be developing something about it, but I don't know what's happened with it.
I will watch that. Yeah. That sounds amazing. Is there a young woman that particularly inspires you?
I've been reading about pirates as well, which is why I was nodding because I was like aware of this person. But also there was 2, I think, terrible researcher, obviously. One of them was Irish and one of them I think was English or American around the same period, and like similar things of like sometimes presenting as male, changing their name, sometimes marrying their way up a kind of social system, and being like fucking amazing pirates and fighters and yeah, I'm inspired by the same, like, I'm stuck in a situation, how can I manoeuvre my way out of it and like enjoy the short time on earth that I've got? Like, people like that are really inspiring, I think.
And thinking back to Flies, when we produce it, hopefully if all goes well in the autumn next year, what would you like women or young women, men, boys, to take away from that play?
I think I'd like young men to at least question one aspect of their behaviour maybe, and then to go and, I'd really love to see them reacting in an artistic way about what it's like to like try and embrace a female gaze or a queer gaze, or at least pause their own male gaze. That would be wonderful. And then like for the young women that come and see it, I hope that they feel empowered and excited and like they want to go and do something. That sort of feeling, like, you know, when you leave I get it when I leave gigs, to be honest, more than I leave the theatre. But you know, when you come out and it's like 2 in the morning, you're buzzing, and you're like, I just need to like go and do something, like that feeling. I hope that we inspire that in them. Just be wonderful to have like a load of young women like roaring their way through East London. So yeah, that kind of feeling, I think.
I'd love that. I'd love to see that happening. I'd love there to be like almost a revolution starting at the end of the show. Those were my questions, but if I may, I'd like to open it up to the floor. Does anyone have a question they might like to ask any of our panel hosts?
Shall we go to responses to catcalls?
Go to responses to catcalls. That's a good one.
I'll just say fuck off.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's sort of, yeah, you sort of, certainly for me, I kind of get that thing, that little like demon in me that kind of bubbles out and wants to tell them off. Almost like a mum moment, you know, you want to kind of point out their bad behaviour. Yeah, go for it. Any other questions?
Hey, what's our question? Yeah, so my question is for you. You know when you were talking about the racial aspect of like just growing up in the male days, obviously like I know our points about like similar, but like how did you or how are you overcoming that? Because obviously like women like have to get, well women in general, you get so fetishized and then it's like you add their race and it's just like,
Yeah, it's hard, I think, because on the flip side of like having like racialized harassment is kind of like people who fetishize you on behalf of your race, and it's always kind of couched in this kind of like, you know, the same way it's like older women saying to like schoolgirls, oh, you should be flattered because I don't get this attention anymore. Like it's always kind of positioned as something you should be pleased about because it can't be that bad if we say like you. Yeah, it's difficult. I think like lots of people wrestle with it. I think from my perspective, I've developed a really finely honed radar for when people are approaching me with like bad intentions. And I think especially for Asian women, I don't know about your background, but there's always a kind of weird, kind of overly keen interest in certain bits of your culture, like that, you know, might not even be reflected in your heritage. So I've had people come and talk to me about Japan, and I literally don't speak any Japanese. I'm not Japanese at all. Like, recently, like people think I'm Korean, so they want to talk to me about Korea. I was like, I've never been to Korea in my life, and it's kind of difficult because I think you don't like. Yes, people can like express an interest and like, you know, like certain bits of Asian culture, but at a certain point, like the alarm bells start ringing for me. There's a really good music video by a Japanese-British musician called Rina Sawayama, where she's like on a date with one of those guys who like has a really obvious Asian fetish, but also is completely clueless about it. It's so funny. I really recommend you check it out. I'm trying to think of what the name is. It's called Shut the Fuck Up.
Nice. Cool. Thanks for your question. Any more questions? Go for it.
I remember sort of being at school and in those really awkward sex education sessions being segregated by our genders, so we would just sit in these different rooms and would only find out later that we were getting very different information and there was no crossover. It feels to me like there are like new strategies that are needed to get boys and girls, especially teenagers, talking, and I wonder for both of you, like, can we kind of imagine what some of those strategies might be? Charlie, I want to theatre and get people into actual spaces. Are there new strategies we can offer to kind of get that conversation started across gender divides?
Yeah, I think, sorry, do you mind if I go first? I think the gender divides, like, thankfully, in most cases are being questioned because there's like a fluidity that's been embraced with like the more like mass media like consciousness of trans people and non-binary people. So I think that slowly, too slowly in my impatient bones, but like slowly there's like less, okay, boys on one side of the room and girls on the other side of the room. There's like other ways of dividing the room into two groups, and more young people are coming out. So hopefully that's changing that. Yeah, I hope more schools do this thing of hiring outside bodies to come in and find ways of like keeping everybody in the same room and giving everybody the information that they need, because yeah, it must be horrible to be a young man that is dating a young woman who's on her period and you don't know anything about periods, for example, and like all you know is the sort of like laddie jokes about periods, and like if you really care about this person and they're like uncomfortable in their body for a couple of days, like to not know anything about that at all is just like really harmful for him. And likewise, like I think, so when I was at school, I think the boys were separated to talk about masturbation and the girls were like told to not have sex because you'll get pregnant or diseases and die. That was my experience. And like obviously everybody masturbates, so like that should be part of the conversation as well, and it's adding to the shaming of it, because the boys came back with this like secret, like they had this smug look on their faces, and I was like, I don't feel smug about what we were just told, so we were obviously told something different. So I think the less separation of like perceived genders before people are old enough to maybe decide would be better, a great place to start, I think. And allowing them space to ask questions that are vulnerable and hard. I think Google in your pocket is really great, but there's something wonderful about engaging with another human, isn't there? It's really scary. Sex is really hard to talk about. Because really we're talking about power and intimacy, and like, it's the same with the male gaze. Like really we're talking about, am I attractive? Do I like being looked at? I want to be looked at but don't want to be looked at. Then we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about power, we're talking about like intrusion of personal space. It's a lot, and like we need help unpacking all of that, I think.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a big task, isn't it? I feel like one way you could try and change things is just trying to teach concepts like consent a lot earlier, like not even necessarily in like a sexual sense, so like, you know, you could easily like talk to a 9-year-old about consent and say, well, do you know, so-and-so went up to you in the playground, just like whacked you on the head, did you consent to that? And kind of explain it in that way. So, you know, to be like, it just means like a physical touch that you did not say agree to receive. And in that way you can like talk about a bunch of things like, you know, bullying, someone like, you know, people picking on each other in the playground, stuff that's more like child friendly. So, but you introduce that idea of consent like a lot earlier. So then when you apply it to sex, it isn't like some big new thing.
Yeah, the countries that are doing that have got like lower rates of sexual violence against women, lower rates of teenage pregnancy. You know, they're just better countries to live in. It would seem places like Sweden seem really cool, and they start from primary school age, like teaching them how to ask to touch someone and how to also give feedback on touch in a way that is age appropriate. I think that's really important as well, to be able to, like your question of like, what are your top tips for when you get catcalled, or what are your responses? It's like how to give feedback on being looked at in a way that's not going to instigate violence, because a lot of it for me has been like, oh, I'm too scared to say something because it's going to escalate quickly, because it's going to shame him if I say no, and like then that will instigate violence, and like that's fucked up on so many levels, of course, but like learning how to give feedback and learning how to receive feedback, if we did that from primary school, like what a beautiful utopia the world would be. It's not even that difficult, it's such a simple thing to change, I think.
Absolutely. Any more questions? Go for it.
Second one. Is there a female gaze to counter a male gaze? If we were in an alternate reality, we've come here to discuss and unpack that. Like, what does, or any other kind of gaze, right? Whether it's a kind of queer gaze or, I don't know, like something that feels very odd now. Like, how do we imagine that? Like, what can we counter a male gaze with? And if we were trying to find that, what would that sound like and look like?
No, I think people are still trying to figure it out. One thing I find really interesting, so I'm on TikTok probably way more than I should be given my actual age. And one of the things I find really interesting about TikTok is there's now like this subgroup of young men who are trying to objectify themselves for a young female gaze. And it's just like, it can range from like very weird because they have no idea what they're doing, to just like kind of playing into these like really like sexist tropes about what women want. So there's one where a guy is like, oh babe, you're on your period, and he comes back and he's like holding all this like chocolate, and he's like, I love you so much. You know, like really cloying, like cheesy stuff. And you know, maybe if you're like 13, like what's like that's what I find really interesting. It's that I think that people are still trying to figure out what that looks like, and especially for like straight women. I mean, like if you're a straight woman, like I've seen straight women like lust after like literally the most random things, like Jeff Goldblum playing a piano, singing a dinosaur. That was one thing my friend found hot the other day. Okay. But I think like it's just like, I think that's what's interesting about the female gaze, is that it's very like wild and riotous. You know, Portrait of a Lady on Fire is a great example of like that queer female gaze and how it doesn't have to be kind of, you know, revealing a lot of skin, like conventionally sexy. So I think, yeah, I think we're still in the midst of kind of figuring it out, and it's something that, you know, straight guys are also trying to figure out, like what women actually like want.
Yeah, that film's a great reference point of like, because narratively there's no male orgasm shape to the structure of that film. There's no like, I am chasing action, like there is a war to fight. There's no like big climax. There's like just very gentle unfolding of desire, and yet there is still dramatic tension. I mean, it won every award that it could have won. Like, it's a beautiful film, but there is no aggressive chase for action. So it's a great example that like our storytelling does not have to follow the male gaze shape, and it can still be excellent. Like, that's really exciting for me. Artists like who's the director? Celine Sciamma.
Yes, Celine Sciamma.
I don't know why I looked at you like you would know. Yeah, they're really exciting. I'm excited by the working it out thing. I think it's like, it's okay that we don't know yet. Like the male gaze has been there for a long time, so it's okay that it might take us a long time, I think. Yeah, let it unfold.
Any more questions? Do you have any questions for our audience?
I'd really like to know when you feel joyful in your body, like spaces, and perhaps if the last 18 months has taught you a bit more about that, like spaces that you feel really joyful in your bodies.
Look,
I think there's something really powerful about good music.
Yeah.
Good music makes me feel really sexy, and then, you know, if you're having a good hair day, or if you've done your makeup really nice, especially for the first time in a while, and you whack on the good music, and the lighting's nice, and when the sun's out, you just gotta take a selfie. Yeah, that makes me feel great.
I was gonna say, like, in lockdown, like, I started watching, well, like the Savage X Fenty thing came out, and also Beyonce's Homecoming came out. So I was like watching this stuff, and then I was like kind of like performing it myself, like in my room, and it just made me happy. Like the Savage X Fenty thing, like seeing so many different bodies made me feel like more confident to like, I don't know, be proud of like my body and stuff like that. And then like not by going out and wearing lingerie, but just by like dancing to what they're doing. That made me like feel like happy, but that's one thing I really enjoyed.
It's gorgeous.
Absolutely.
That show is so good.
Yeah.
I should watch it like at least twice a week.
Great. Well, unless there's another question, all good. So to me, say thank you so much. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Zing. And thank you all for joining us here today. If you'd like to find out more about Boundless, about the work we're doing, do check out our website, our social channels. We're doing lots more talks coming up very soon. So thank you so much.